Kirk Allen, Christopher Reeve, Brandon Routh, Henry Cavill. These are the four actors who've played Superman on the big screen. And yet only one of them deserves the title, the most disrespected Superman, and that'll be Henry Cavill himself. And that's what this episode's going to be all about. But before we get into this week's main topic, let's kick things off the way we always do here on the show, with an update on the countdown to James Gunn's Superman. So currently the countdown sits at 43 weeks. So we are 43 weeks. We are less than 10 months away from the arrival of James Gunn's Superman to a big screen near you, where hopefully David Corenswet won't have to vie for the title of most disrespected Superman one day. Hopefully his run as Superman will not be creatively snake bit practically right out of the gate the way Henry Cavill's was. So we're 43 weeks away from that, and as such, this week's Superman on Film update centers all around the potential promotion for the movie. Yes, this week's Superman on Film update is almost entirely centered on some trailer rumors. That's right, because now that we are less than 10 months out, we know that promotion for the film is going to be ramping up sooner rather than later. And the questions start becoming, do they roll out a trailer in front of Joker 2, which is coming out this month? Is it this month? I'm not even sure, but it's coming out soon, right? Or do they open it, do they put the trailer at New York Comic Con, October 19th, when James Gunn has now confirmed that DC Studios will be here in my hometown on Saturday, October 19th. To unveil some interesting new tidbits about the seeds being planted for the DC universe, as well as primarily to promote the arrival of Creature Commandos, which will be the first official DC Studios project. So will they do it there? Will they do it at another Comic-Con that James Gunn has now confirmed he'll be attending? Regardless, the rumors are starting to spring up. There's even people claiming to have seen the trailer, and they're leaking descriptions of a trailer out there into the world. And honestly, I'm not going to go into all those things. That kind of stuff doesn't interest me. And honestly, most of what I've heard, I don't really buy just yet. So that's why I only pass along rumors that I can picture that have some sort of credibility, or that I've spoken to people who verified it in some way enough for me to put it out there for you. So I'm going to spare you the gory details and some of the bizarre rumors that are out there about what's included in the trailers. And let's instead just talk about the fact that this is a very real thing now, right? The movie is in post-production. It's really coming. Pinch me. We're starting to talk about the first teasers. Like, we're almost there. Within a few months' time, there's going to be an episode of this show that opens up with me talking about what that teaser that dropped this week was like. I can't wait for that. And aside from that, it's going to be interesting to see what the strategy is. Do they want to do it at a Comic-Con where it's really going to, speak to the geeks and the fanboys primarily first? Or are they going to go for a much more wide berth, right? One of the rumors is that they'll do it at this very next Super Bowl that's coming up, right? That is a very smart place to debut a teaser trailer. You have millions of people watching live. At this point, it is one of the very few spectacles on television that attracts millions and millions of people to watch live at the very exact same time. So that would also be an interesting primetime way to do it. It's going to be just interesting to see which promotional route are they going to take with this. And of course, I'm going to be here geekily breaking it all down with you every week. But, I enjoy these little nuances. Right? Because when they were promoting Superman Returns, what did they have to promote? They had to promote that this is a familiar Superman that you know and love and remember already. And they had to try to appeal to your nostalgia. And that's what they did with the Superman Returns teaser. But then when it was time to tease Man of Steel, they had to tease how utterly different this was. And they had to do some, tonal things to really make sure you knew this is not related to the old Superman movies that you've seen before. And now it's just going to be interesting again, where we've had some Superman action fairly recently. As recently as October of 2022, we had Henry Cavill showing up at the end of Black Adam, seemingly promising more of that storyline. So as far as the world is concerned, there's been some Superman stuff going on that they may or may not be paying attention to. So how will this movie attempt to get your attention, let you know what it is or isn't connected to, and most importantly, get you excited for what's to come? Because that's the big question now. Can DC still get the masses excited after years and years of executive mismanagement at Warner Brothers Pictures? Because really, the story of Henry Cavill's run as Superman and the story of how he became the most disrespected Superman is really just a story of executive mismanagement. It's a story of a studio not having any idea what they're doing with one of the most sacred characters in all of popular culture for 86 years now. So, you know what? Let's go ahead and get into this topic. Henry Cavill, the most disrespected Superman. And there's going to be a couple of things that I should just sort of set up here right out of the gate. There needs to be a filter with which we look at all this so that you understand where I'm coming from right out of the gate. So the two things I want you to understand before we even start the whole retrospective deep dive on his run as Superman and all the ways in which Warner Brothers let him down. Before we get into that deep dive, let's just establish two things. One, Superman Returns taught all the wrong lessons to Warner Brothers, or at least they learned all the wrong lessons from Superman Returns. Because look, Superman Returns, it was a very expensive film. It was a very risky proposition, and it had a lot working against it too. Because when we talk about how expensive Superman Returns was, some people don't realize to this day that that reported budget that it had also contained within it all of the failed reboots of Superman that led up to it. That's right. Nicolas Cage's $20 million that he earned to play Superman in Superman Lives and then didn't even make the movie. He still made that 20 mil. All right. Tim Burton still made like 5 mil, and millions were still invested in developing costumes and building sets. And then that project eventually went away. But those costs were tacked onto the eventual cost for Superman Returns. So this movie had an uphill battle right out of the gate, and it ultimately didn't connect. It had a decent Rotten Tomatoes score of around 72%. It was considered fresh. And for fans like me who had just been waiting forever to see a Superman that they loved and recognized and were hoping to see with regularity again, for people like me, we saw it as a decent start, but we were also hoping, hopefully this gets better with part 2. And, I saw what Bryan Singer did from X-Men 1 to X-Men 2. So hopefully Superman will level up similarly. But it didn't exactly blow anyone away. It wasn't an instant classic. And box office wise, it didn't even hit 400 million. At a time when the Spider-Man movies were making much more than that, at a time when the X-Men movies were finding great success over for Fox, at a time when the Pirates of the Caribbean movies were making an insane amount of dough, Warner Brothers thought bringing back Superman, this is going to bring us right to that top level. We're going to have a top level franchise making that sick money again. And look, we're going to build it on top of the Christopher Reeve legacy. We're going to treat this like this is Superman 5, and it's going to have the familiar music, and we're going to get Marlon Brando back in there, and we're going to literally just reignite everyone's old love for Christopher Reeve, and this is going to work. And it didn't end up working, And when I say that the studio learned the wrong lessons, it was that for some reason they looked at Superman Returns and decided that its failure somehow meant that audiences were no longer interested in a traditional Superman. They interpreted this as, well, see, the Reeves Superman wouldn't fly in today's society. Now this is a world post 9/11 where what people really want are hard-hitting, gritty, relatable characters. That's why Batman Begins is what we're going to really be investing in from now on. And Superman Returns, we're going to throw that out and reboot. Warner Brothers really got it into their heads that Superman is outdated and boring and a Boy Scout, and he needs to be reinvented for modern audiences. That's what they took away from Superman Returns' failure. And it's, to me, like, the reason that misses the mark is that Superman Returns didn't really present a classic Superman. It may have been trying to ape the Christopher Reeve movies. It may have copied whole bullet points of the plot of the first movie. It may echo and call to mind lots of fun moments from the other movies. But if you go back and watch Superman Returns, it doesn't have much of that sense of wonder. It doesn't have much of the actual charm and joy of Superman in it. It's actually a rather sad, lonely movie about a Superman who was so desperate to feel connected to something that he abandoned Earth and abandoned the woman he loves for 5 years, and then comes back and finds that she's moved on and she has a son with seemingly another man, and the world is still messed up and needing him all the time, and he's still alone at the end of it all. And it's a very kind of gloomy movie. You know, it wasn't a classic uplifting Superman tale at all. And yet the takeaway seemed to be, no, we need to just reinvent Superman somehow. We need to make him more tough and more of an action hero, and people want to see him punch stuff. People want to see two gods flying over a city blowing stuff up. No more of this classic good guy trying to save cats out of trees Superman. We need a big, tough, awesome, badass action hero Superman. And that was the wrong lesson they learned, because it seemed to be the primary way that they approached rebooting the property. And it might be why they were so happy to bring Zack Snyder on board, and they knew he was going to bring the epic action. He was going to bring that larger than life comic book visual element to all this, and he's going to make us care. And on the top of that, we have Christopher Nolan and David Goyer writing it. So this is going to be the movie that's going to give us all of that Batman grit and character development, everything that the Dark Knight trilogy did for Batman. This is going to do for Superman, and Zack Snyder's going to be there to make it look amazing. What could go wrong? And, well, we're going to get to how this could all go wrong. But that was point one. Point one was just right out of the gate. Henry Cavill's run as Superman was being informed by flimsy logic. Right out of the gate, they wanted to make a Superman that was like reinventing the character, and they were totally not realizing that what didn't work with Superman Returns was that also it was mopey and lonely and kind of a miserable ride. They totally missed that and just thought, we need action heroes Superman now. So that's point one for why he was snake bit right out of the gate. And something else that I need you all to hear me on as we go through this retrospective look at Henry's career, okay? We all saw different movies, and you have to respect that. You have to understand that Henry's best work wasn't even seen by the masses, okay? We overlook this. Because most of the people who adore Henry Cavill's Superman, most of the people who adore the Snyderverse and want to see it restored and want to see it sold to Netflix, most of those people are doing it based on alternate cuts of two of Henry's movies. Okay, they're not doing it based on the theatrical cut of Batman vs. Superman, which even most Snyder fans will admit that version is the inferior cut of the movie. It's the cut of the movie that doesn't flow as well, where they cut out a lot of the subplots, and a lot of Clark Kent's actual subplots aren't in there. Okay? So most Snyder fans know that the Batman vs. Superman that everyone in the world saw was an incomplete, less than version of the movie. And then with Justice League, the better cut of that one was the Zack Snyder's Justice League, which again, that was only seen by a much smaller audience. The one that was shown to the world, and the one that said, from director Zack Snyder, Justice League, that's the one that came out in 2017, where Henry's face looked like hell. And we're going to get to that later in this episode. But you've got to remember that when you're arguing with people who said that his Superman was no good or that his movies sucked, these people went to the movies and saw the theatrical cut of BVS and the theatrical cut of Justice League. So you can't convince them that Henry was amazing because you like the director's cut of those two movies. Like, it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, we can only really discuss en masse the versions of the movies that everyone saw, that all the fans bought tickets to go see. And unfortunately, that is just the theatrical cuts of the movies. So as we go through this and I say some things about these theatrical cuts that might wound you, just remember, I'm looking at this from the vantage point of how the world saw Henry, how the world experienced Henry Cavill's Superman. I'm not doing it from my own personal thing, and I'm going to throw in my 2 cents here and there, but I'm trying to give you the bigger picture of how Henry Cavill's Superman was presented to the world, was disrespected from behind the scenes, and why ultimately that disrespect is what prevented him from becoming this generation's Superman. So let's do it. Let's go back in time and let's analyze the last 20 years, because that's right. It's actually been 20 years since Henry Cavill's journey as Superman actually began, because 20 years ago in 2004 was kind of where the Superman disrespect for Henry began, because he was cast as Superman in Mick G's Superman Flyby movie that it was written by J.J. Abrams. And you could find pictures from his screen tests out there in the world. He had, and Brandon Routh had read for it as well, and a few other familiar faces. But Henry snagged the role, and for a brief window of time where that was the Superman reboot we were going to be getting, Henry was Superman. And then that went away. Warner Brothers decided rather than move forward with Mick G's reboot, they were going to move forward with Bryan Singer's pseudo-sequel, Superman Returns. And Bryan Singer looked at Henry Cavill, and I think he let him audition, but ultimately he went the Brandon Routh role. So right then, Henry was given the part and then lost the part before he could even do anything with it. So that was already step one in, gee, thanks. And the funny thing is, it became a kind of a bit of a running thing in his career, where now for the next several years after 2004, Henry was the guy who was almost people. Because while he was almost Superman, he also was a finalist for James Bond before Daniel Craig got James Bond, leading into the reboot of that franchise, Casino Royale. So he was a finalist for Superman, had been cast as Superman and lost it. He was a finalist for James Bond and lost it. And then there's other famous stories too, where there had been a fan campaign to try to get him to be Cedric Diggory in Harry Potter's Goblet of Fire. Then there was also a movement to try to get him to be Edward Cullen in the Twilight movies, a part that ultimately went to Robert Pattinson, Batman himself. And basically for years, Henry was this actor who would be in contention for lots of different iconic roles, but for whatever reason, just couldn't lock it down, couldn't actually get the part, you know? And that all changed, thankfully, in 2011, when he was cast again as Superman, and this time it stuck. And it's pretty cool, too, because as part of the audition that he had with Zack Snyder, they got the Christopher Reeve costume out of the archives. And Henry wore it for the auditions. And rumors, not even rumors, Zack Snyder has said that the dignity with which he wore that suit and the way he was able to wear it without looking silly or hokey, that's what got him the part more than anything. He was able to wear this practically sort of pseudo goofy primary color looking old fashioned superhero suit, and he wore it with pride and dignity and looked like Superman along the way. So he got the part, and it was announced on January 30th, 2011. I remember when they first announced it, I didn't have too much of an opinion. I had seen zero of his work. I had heard the name come up for years. I remembered back in 2004 hearing about this British guy who looks just like he could be Superman and all this stuff, but I had never seen it. I'd heard all about the Count of Monte Cristo. I'd heard he'd been in this movie Immortals. I'd heard all about this work he had done and that he was a legitimate actor and all this stuff. But I didn't experience any of it, so I had no real opinion. So all I could really go on was his look. And to me, yeah, he looked like a chiseled out of stone kind of Superman-ish figure. He didn't give off the Superman vibes or energy like I say certain actors do, where just some certain actors there's like a warmth that radiates from behind their eyes that makes you feel like, ooh, he's got Superman energy. He's got that like, I'm your perpetual friend and I'm gentle and I'm here to help energy. Henry didn't have that. Henry looked to me more just like your standard Hollywood heartthrob, good looking guy who, whatever. I didn't have much of an opinion, in other words. And watching the teasers for the movie and the trailers for the movie, I could tell like, okay, he's going to be playing a much more serious, a much more pained, much more vulnerable version of this character. So let's see what it's like. I loved the Dark Knight trilogy. So let's see with that same mindset, maybe they could show me some layers to Clark Kent, Kal-El, Superman that I've never seen before. And, let's give this a shot. And by the time that third trailer came out, like I was sold, I was ready. Let's go see Man of Steel. And then in June of 2013, Man of Steel arrives. And, my take on the movie was, at the time, it was like a 6.5 out of 10. To me, it was not an instant classic. To me, it had a lot of beautiful moments. But I always wished if you could have shaved off like 15 or 20 minutes of the action stuff in the third act and put it into the second act and kind of help some of the character arcs a little bit and focus a little more on Superman inspiring hope and saving lives rather than Superman punching stuff. I thought it could have been an instant classic, but as such, I thought it was just a decent start. I didn't think it was anything incredible. I didn't think it sucked. I didn't understand what all the controversy was over him killing General Zod. I just thought, this is a new vision. Let's give them some room to operate in here. But I also thought, it was all right. And more than anything with Henry, I was more so excited for the future. I was like, okay, he did this first movie where obviously there's supposed to be a lot of growing pains. It's his first day on the job, more or less, and thousands of people die. And there's this huge alien invasion, and he's indirectly the fault of it. And listen, it's a heavy first contact sci-fi alien movie, And I was like, okay, that's the first chapter. But I was looking forward to the future. I was like, okay, but now we got through those bumps and the first day on the job. And now in the sequels, now he's in Metropolis. We've introduced the Clark Kent alter ego at the Daily Planet. So now we're going to get to see the Clark Kent reporter interacting with Perry White and Jimmy Olsen and learning how to differentiate the Clark Kent alter ego from Superman so that other people don't, we were going to get into a lot more classic Superman stuff. And I thought maybe in this next one is where he will develop some kind of a fortress of solitude. Or maybe in the next movie is where, the first movie was just getting him in the suit. And in the next movie, it's going to be about him winning over the people of Earth who look at him and they're not sure how to feel about him yet. So more than anything, I was excited for the future. I didn't see anything that made me fall in love yet. But I was still open to falling in love with this version of Superman coming down the line. And unfortunately, behind the scenes, this was the first big fork in the road that Warner Brothers was at with Henry Cavill's Superman, where they went the wrong way. They went the wrong way because they came to a fork where in one direction is Man of Steel 2, right? In one direction is Man of Steel 2, a proper solo sequel where now we further establish Henry as Superman. We show how important he becomes to this world and how he eventually becomes embraced. And, this is going to be the next stage in his development and start to flesh out his world a little more and all that kind of stuff. And maybe even address some of the critiques from Man of Steel. Because look, Man of Steel came out. And while it made a decent amount of money and $670 million and it was a bigger success than Superman Returns, it was not some like runaway, feel good, happy, well-received, successful movie. Because you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score and it's considered rotten. It has like a 52 or 53%. So it's considered basically a 50-50 proposition. Half the people who saw it liked it. Half the people who saw it didn't like it. And a lot of the online discourse around the film was about the fact that it just felt kind of joyless and over-reliant on destruction and world-destroying finales and less on the joys of Superman and showing him saving lives and inspiring others. Because that's what a lot of people for years have gotten used to from Superman stories. We don't go to Superman stories to see him beat people up. We go to see him change lives, to help people. We see him inspire. We see him try to figure out, how can I do the most help without having to hurt or kill anybody? So the negative word around Man of Steel was around that, the over-reliance on action, the lack of emotion, and the lack of showing that emotional, virtuous Superman that we're all used to seeing, where he's inspiring others to be better. And I felt like, at this fork in the road that I'm talking about, in a solo movie, they could have addressed all that. They even just by simply bringing in a different director and different writers, just like, you can creatively breathe new air into these characters without having to like reboot them. If you look at how Wonder Woman in her solo movie, the way she was portrayed as slightly different than what we saw in Batman versus Superman, that proves my point. That with somebody else calling the shots, the characters can really flourish. A few years later, Jason Momoa's Aquaman proved that with his director that's now escaping me. But either way, the point is, these characters could thrive, but they just needed different creative blood. And with Superman 2, with Man of Steel 2, they could have addressed that. They didn't have to keep Zack Snyder. They could have done a Man of Steel 2 with Matthew Vaughn or any number of other directors who would have been happy to do a Superman movie and take him into a more traditional direction. But instead of going that way, they went down the other side of the fork. And on the other side of the fork, what you had was essentially, let's double down on the parts that people had trouble with Man of Steel. Let's double down on how morally sort of conflicted this Clark Kent is. And let's double down on how sort of unhappy his experience as Superman is. What a burden it is to be Superman when you're just trying to help, but you have all these people who hate you and blame you for the things that happened as the darkest counter reaction to something good you did. It was a much darker, more tormented way to go with the character. And rather than focus on how he could redeem himself there, we're going to have him fight another beloved character, Batman. And by the end of this story, we're going to kill Superman. So at a fork in the road where they could have built upon the end of Man of Steel and continue to flesh out his world and get us to fall in love with him, they went down this other path where the focus became on setting up a Justice League team and killing off Superman to justify needing a Justice League team. And Superman basically just got lost in the shuffle. They went this route almost immediately because it was not even a month and a half after Man of Steel came out that at San Diego Comic-Con that year, Zack Snyder announced that they were doing a Batman versus Superman movie. So at this very crucial fork in the road, Warner Brothers decided to go with Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice as its next phase for this new Superman that they've just introduced. And curiously, too, rather than trying to rein in Zack Snyder's ideas, because if you think about it, it was really his ideas that were the controversial part of Man of Steel. Nobody really complained about Henry's acting. No one really complained about the script, which was written by Christopher Nolan and David Goyer. You know, nobody complained about those elements. They complained about Zack Snyder's stuff. His over-reliance on operatic visuals where the actual stuff being shown is lacking in emotion. And the over-reliance on huge destruction and big, huge mythological comic book iconography at the, completely overlooking the importance of just creating heartfelt, emotional characters. And, they decided Zack's way of doing things is going to be how we do everything now. Huh? Like, I've never understood what Warner Brothers and DC Entertainment were thinking between 2013 and 2015. I just don't know. Because they looked at all of the things that people were mad about from Man of Steel and said, hey, Zack, let's lean into that. And let's make Batman hate Superman for all the reasons that those critics hated Man of Steel. And this will show that we hear them. And Superman will ultimately, he'll redeem himself, and it'll be great for all of us. I don't know what they were thinking, but it was stupid. Okay? It was ridiculous. And listen, I'm not the only one who thought so, because they got buyer's remorse before the movie even came out. They made this decision, and they let Zack Snyder not only set the tone for BVS, right? Because he was heavily involved with crafting that story with Chris Terrio after David Goyer was initially there to map out the beats of it. But he also was the guy deciding what everyone looked like. He was the one casting all the core members of the Justice League. He was the one establishing the initial mythical building blocks for each one of these characters. So any director who came on to do a Cyborg movie or a Flash movie or a Wonder Woman movie was going to have to build upon Zack Snyder's ideas, not create their own, but build upon his ideas. So he had this opportunity to essentially, he set the tone for BVS. He had created the outlines for Justice League 1, 2. He had created the outline for what Wonder Woman would be, for how Suicide Squad would be presented, because it had to fill in the gaps between Superman dying and us getting to the events of Justice League. And it had to have some kind of an impact on James Wan's Aquaman movie. So basically everything Zack Snyder was working on from 2013 through 2015 was going to have seismic impacts on the rest of the DC universe as we knew it, because they put all their eggs in the Batman versus Superman Dawn of Justice basket. They needed this movie to be so good that people were going to be excited for everything that was going to be coming afterward. That's what, and Zack Snyder it was his vision that had to introduce the world to something that was hopefully going to be massively successful. Meanwhile, it was his creative flourishes, like deciding to kill Zod and to do all of that world destroying stuff at the end of Man of Steel. It was his creative instincts that hurt Man of Steel, but it was his creative instincts that they handed all of DC to. And again, don't hate the player, hate the game. I'm not mad at Zack Snyder. Zack, he has a vision. He has a way that he likes to tell these stories. And hey, spoiler alert, I thought Zack Snyder's Justice League was phenomenal. It's one of the greatest things I've ever seen of DC on film. So I'm not saying any of this as some sort of Zack Snyder either fan or hater. I'm just telling you from an executive level. I don't know how you looked at the response to Man of Steel and thought the answer to that is to give that director more control. And on the contrary, let's give him control over more than just one character now. It just doesn't make sense. And they caught it themselves, but too late. They caught it with the movie about to come out. They saw the rough cuts of the movie. They saw the early screenings of the movie, and they realized, what did we do? This vision isn't going to work. So now we have to cut a half hour out of Batman versus Superman. Now we need to go to David Ayer and reshoot a bunch of his movie and get outside editors to make 6 different cuts and test them all and try to find one that'll work. And we're going to let Patty Jenkins kind of forget some of the stuff that was established in BVS so that Wonder Woman can separate itself and really be successful. And we're like, they made so many sweeping changes that even the Justice League movie that was about to enter production, that they had already approved, they started rewriting it before BVS even came into theaters. They lost faith in Zack Snyder before the first film in his plan even came out. They were inept and reactionary and out of their minds, because what do? When you see those first screenings of BVS and you realize, we've got a problem here. We're hinging an entire universe on this movie, and this movie's problematic. What do? If you're smart, it hurts, but you delay the movie. And you delay everything. You delay everything that's relying on this movie. And you go, hang on, we cannot release this, because if this is the first real introduction the world has to this wider universe of DC characters, we're doomed. We've got to fix this. And clearly they thought they had to fix it, right? You don't chop a half hour hastily off of a movie right before it comes out because you think the movie's great. You don't start rewriting Justice League because you think Justice League is in awesome shape. You don't hijack David Ayer's Suicide Squad because you think this is all going splendidly. You do all this because you're panicking. And if you're panicking, the best bet is not to rush all these things out with half-baked CG and poorly rewritten scenes and missing big swaths of subplot that would make the big final moments land better. You don't do that. You delay the movies, you re-edit them, you reshoot some things, you get it to a place where you're comfortable with it, and then you announce a release date, and then we proceed from there. Henry's Superman was paying the ultimate cost at this point, because rather than having his Man of Steel 2, his sequel got hijacked and turned into this big, troublesome issue. And the studio, rather than try to solve the problem, decided to just double down on all of their insane decisions instead. And when the movie came out, it was such a disservice to Henry, because that theatrical cut that released on March 26, 2016, that 2.5 hour cut of the 3-hour opus of Zack Snyder's BVS Dawn of Justice, that half hour that had been chopped, a lot of it was Henry's subplot. A lot of it was the stuff that would have helped you to understand what Clark Kent's mentality was behind, what was going on with Clark, with why he had such distrust over Batman. A lot of what was cut was part of the justification for why these two heroes would even fight. Because remember, that was the big uphill battle this film faced with mass audiences right out of the gate. Because look, the fanboys were going to be there no matter what. The geeks and the fanboys were always going to want to check out Batman and Superman fighting, because it's the kind of geeky fight and conversation we've all been having for decades and decades. Who would win? And can Batman outsmart Superman? And does he have kryptonite arrows? And all these silly little hypotheticals, right? The geeks, the fanboys, the nerds, we were going to be there no matter what, because we all know what's going to happen. Right? All of us who know the comics, who know the general outlines for these characters, we know that any movie that's called Batman versus Superman is not going to be a movie about seeing them fight to the death. It's going to be a movie where they have a disagreement, but ultimately come to the same side and go against a common enemy. We all know that. But for mass audiences, it was always going to sound a little strange to have these two beloved heroes, these two perpetual good guys, fight each other. And it wasn't like what was going on over in Marvel, where they had already been setting up for a while that Iron Man and Captain America both look at heroism very differently. And there were seeds of dissension being planted from the moment those characters met each other. They were like oil and water. So by the time we got to Captain America Civil War, where you have these two heroes butting heads, it had been built to, and you could understand, oh, wow, okay, these fundamental differences are going to lead to a crazy conflict before they ultimately bury the hatchet. But for most outsiders, you hear Batman versus Superman, and you're like, well, I'm going to need to be sold here. I'm going to need to believe that there's some reason on God's green earth where Superman would want to punch another human being. You know, because we know Superman is all about restraint and all about trying to help and all about trying to inspire and aid others. This idea that he could ever be so irrationally upset at another human being that he would want to punch them, like that's a tall hill to climb. You have to convince people that Superman would want to do that, especially since most people love Batman. Batman's one of the most beloved pop culture figures. You know, this is like trying to have Donald Duck fight Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny, and it's like these are beloved, iconic figures. That's like, why are you trying to have them fight? But in trying to get them to fight, there were scenes put in there. Chris Terrio did his best. There are some funny quotes out there that I've read on previous podcasts where, you know, he also thought that this idea was outlandish and insane, but he had to make the most of it. And he had to bring as much heft to the script as possible to get you to understand why Clark would go to this dark place and why Bruce was in this dark place. And yet, when you see that theatrical cut of Batman versus Superman, most of the focus is getting you to relate to Bruce Wayne, Batman. Very little of it is trying to get you to relate to Clark Kent, Superman. And it's just, this was supposed to be the sequel to Man of Steel. And here you are with Henry Cavill's Superman basically being treated somewhat like a villain. Because when you look at the world from Bruce's vantage point, Superman doesn't look so hot. He really doesn't. He doesn't come off that heroic in BVS. And the fact that the theatrical cut of the movie let that version be the version of Superman that everyone sees, it's just such a slap in the face. Henry Cavill's Superman was never able to recover from that. He was never able to recover from BVS. He was never able to recover from that line where he says, "No one can stay good." He was never able to recover from the nightmare sequences where it looks like he's trying to burn Batman to death with his glowing eyes. Like, that's just not what people want from a Superman story. It is not the visuals that people think of when they think of Superman. And yet, BVS just doubled down. They took all of the angsty, serious, angry Man of Steel stuff and made that pretty much all of Superman's part of BVS. And there was none of that first flight joy. There was none of just how incredible it is to be Superman and wanting to help and having to overcome people's misunderstandings, but doing so with a sense of pride where they're going to understand one day that I'm just here to help. And this is hard, but it's going to, it's going to be okay. We didn't see any of that. We saw a Superman who looked sad and miserable and died at the end of it. And I'm not lying. Okay, this isn't just my opinion. The results of BVS speak for themselves. Because when that film came out, remember, Man of Steel was kind of a mixed property. It got like a 53% or so on Rotten Tomatoes. 50-50 proposition, right? But BVS, that was 26%. That was the vast majority of people who saw it said, I can't really recommend this. Only about a third of the people who saw it said, actually a fourth. A fourth of the people who saw BVS, the theatrical cut, thought that was a trip worth taking. I want to do more of that. Because if you study the box office results on BVS, like, not only is the week 1 to week 2 drop notable, but even the Friday to Sunday drop within that first weekend is notable. Right out of the gate, people saw BVS and the anti-word of mouth began. And it's interesting, too, because Warner Brothers had done its best to try to mitigate that. It's like they knew that this movie was going to be a problem, right? They had had those test screenings. They knew this was a problematic movie. And you know that they were worried about it for a couple of reasons, right? You knew because the trailers revealed everything. Before this movie came out, every big secret of the film was already revealed, including a look at Doomsday. And as soon as you see Doomsday, you know Superman's going to die. So it's like literally trailer 3 was one of the biggest turnoffs I've ever seen for a movie trailer. I remember I was part of the Los Fanboys podcast at the time over on Latino Review. And I remember when that trailer came out, we were all mystified at how do you show all that? The fact that it has Batman and Superman in the title should mean that you don't have to try too hard. These are two of the most beloved figures, so just give us some cool teases of their conflict and leave the movie at that. Even the title sells what you're trying to go for. Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. Anyone else, even a layman, sees Dawn of Justice and knows, oh, this is setting up a Justice League movie. So if I go see this, I'm likely to see other Justice League members. Like, you know, the title told you what the movie was. A teaser or two would have given you an idea for the concept of the movie, and they could have just left it at that. And yet in trailer 3, they're like, yep, it's Batman wanting to fight Superman. Oh, and there's Wonder Woman wandering around, and there's a whole little dynamic there. Oh, now we're going to show you that she is Wonder Woman. We're going to show you all 3 of them in the suit. So you're going to have the big Trinity reveal in a trailer. Oh, and we know that Batman and Superman are going to end up on a team. So, let's just go and show you who they're going to fight. Here's Doomsday. It was just unbelievable. Just executive level mismanagement across the board. Whoever approved the trailers, whoever was behind the overall thought process on these movies at the time should just be thrown into a dungeon somewhere. Okay? Because by the time this movie came out, there was bad will against it. Because the trailers had done such a poor job of getting people excited that now people were already kind of like, this movie, do I go see it to see just how bad it is? And the studio, knowing that this movie is going to be problematic, they tried to maximize profits by doing an international day and date release. What that means is, at a period in time when in the Hollywood studios were doing these sort of timed releases where a movie will open in one market and then a week or two later open in another market, and then a week or two later open in another market. So basically the movie kind of goes on like a world tour, allowing it to get, build up word of mouth. And by the time it gets to that third or fourth market, it's this huge gargantuan success. And it was all based on the goodwill and the word of mouth because people are all excited. Marvel was doing stuff like that. The Star Wars movies were doing stuff like that. A lot of the successful IP franchises at the time were not doing simultaneous international day and date releases. It was just a way to try to extend the life of the movie and extend the profits of the movie. When it came to BVS, since they knew the word of mouth is going to stink, we had better release we release this in every single market at the very same time so everyone can see it. We can have a crazy opening weekend and then just hope for the best after that. And look, it worked temporarily. I remember when that weekend came out, it was like a big deal. It was actually some sort of world record that when it opened to like 393 million or 397 million worldwide in one weekend, it had broken a record, and it gave this false impression that the movie was a success, but unfortunately, it was misleading. It was misleading because by weekend 2, the historic drops, the movie went off a cliff where almost like a 70% drop occurred from weekend 1 to weekend 2 because everyone who did turn up on weekend 1, aside from 25% of them, Most of them told their friends, it wasn't so good, or it was terrible. And now Henry Cavill's Superman was at this, once again, in this vulnerable position where he had 2 movies under his belt, but neither one had been well received. In fact, they were getting worse received as we went along. It was not a good place for Henry Cavill's Superman, and his woes would continue. Because look, that year they also mentioned, they wanted to make a solo movie. Danny Garcia, his manager, was talking about it at the end of the summer of 2016, when Warner Brothers was trying to reboot DC without delaying anything by bringing in Jeff Johns and John Berg and hijacking all these movies. While they were trying to do that, there was also apparently work being done on a solo Superman movie that would never see the light of day. There was also being work done on a solo Ben Affleck Batman movie that would never see the light of day. Because the truth is, no one really realized just how much damage Batman versus Superman had done until the following year. It wasn't until November of 2017 that we learned exactly how much the theatrical cut of BVS had turned off the world from this vision. But before we get to that, before we get to when the film actually came out, let's talk about that creative pivot, right? Because a lot has been made about this pivot that DC took after BVS, where they fired some previous executives and they brought in Jeff Johns and John Berg, and they started really heavily promoting that DC was going to be about hope and optimism and joy and fun. And Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was out there posting stuff on social media trying to get people excited for his Black Adam movie. And all of a sudden there was all this renewed talk that, listen, we know that things are a little right now, but they're going to get better. We promise. And the funny thing is, Henry was right on board with that. Henry was right on board with that. Even as his Superman was going through some insane behind the scenes turmoil, Henry was hoping that they could work all this out in time for him to continue on as Superman with a renewed sense of life. Because just to put you into his red boots for a second, okay? BVS comes out in March of 2016, becomes an instant meme. People start making fun of the Martha moment. People start making fun of Ben Affleck's detached, miserable stare in the middle of interviews because he's realized that he's part of something that most people are about to hate for a while. The movie was not going well, and 1 month later, he had to enter principal photography on Justice League, which was being actively rewritten, where a newly finished rewritten script had not been turned in, where the plan was to enter production and have Zack Snyder directing scenes with Jeff Johns looming over one shoulder and John Berg looming over another, and them trying to create some coherent vision from all of these different cooks now in the kitchen. And he had to film this Justice League movie with all of this different creative input. And then when that rough cut gets shown, once again, the reaction is, this movie is in trouble. This movie needs to be saved. And in January of 2017, again, rather than delaying Justice League, they decided to bring in Joss Whedon and reshoot half the movie and rework more than half the scenes with only a few months left till the movie comes out. It was just insane. It was insane. It's criminal IP malpractice. How do you do this to your Justice League? And more importantly, how do you do this to Superman? How do you do this to Superman? Because when they came back for those reshoots with Joss Whedon, Henry had already moved on. Henry was in production for Mission Impossible Fallout, and he had all this facial hair that he was not allowed to shave because his part was still actively being shot, and there were more scenes that had to happen, and they couldn't have him clean shaven. It would have destroyed continuity. So we entered this period of time that we adoringly referred to as Mustache Gate, where Henry showed up to film new scenes as Superman for Joss Whedon's version of Justice League, with the hope that they were going to be able to remove, using digital effects, all of his facial hair and all of his mustache, and make his face match up with previously shot footage for this Justice League. And we'll get to how well that went over in a second. But before we get to the actual release of the movie, it's important to note that Henry was fully on board with the creative decisions being made at this time. And I know this is a bit of a taboo subject because it seems like this means that he was not happy with Zack Snyder. It means that he's almost sort of biting the hand that feeds, right? Because Zack Snyder's Man of Steel is what brought Henry to the Superman dance. So how could he speak ill of Zack Snyder's vision? I know it's a tough pill to swallow for some fans. And listen, I'm not saying that he doesn't have love and respect for Zack and that they haven't shown it since. He'll probably always have love and respect for Zack Snyder. But some of these quotes I'm about to read to you in the lead up to the theatrical release of Justice League are going to make very clear what Henry thought needed to happen and how precisely on board he was with what was going on. So first things first, here's a quote from October of 2017. He said, "Even if Marvel didn't exist, we'd struggle. There was a style they were going for, an attempt to be different and look at things from a slightly different perspective, which hasn't necessarily worked. Yes, it has made money, but it has not been a critical success. It hasn't given everyone that sensation which superheroes should give the viewer." You hear that? You hear that? There was a style they were going for that hasn't necessarily worked. Who is the they? He's talking about Snyder and company, the people who made BVS and had charted the course for these next few movies that were coming out. Then he goes on to say, "I feel like now the right mistakes have been made and they haven't been pandered to. And we can start telling the stories in the way they need to be told. It is even better to come back from a mistake or stylistic error into the correct vein because it will make it seem that much stronger. Wonder Woman was the first step in the right direction." And you notice he's saying that in October because, yes, in June of that year, Wonder Woman came out, and that was not a Zack Snyder movie. But it was a character that had been introduced in a Zack Snyder movie. And yet that movie was the first of the DCEU films to actually be a success across the board. It was the first one. Its opening exceeded box office expectations. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive. The fan response was overwhelmingly positive. And by the end of it, everyone seemed to want more Wonder Woman. It was all the things that hadn't happened after Man of Steel. It was all the things that hadn't happened after Batman versus Superman. They had happened after Wonder Woman. And that was a project that the new creative leadership had had a hand in forming. You know, that was where Jeff Johns let Patty Jenkins have more creative license and basically let her retcon this idea that Wonder Woman abandoned humanity for 100 years, as Zack Snyder had claimed that she had in BVS. Like, this was a movie where the creators were allowed to sort of distance themselves from decisions made by Snyder, and it paid off royally. Wonder Woman was a smash hit, and it made suddenly everyone think, okay, maybe DC can be okay here. But let's continue with Henry's comments, because he would also say, regarding the Superman that we were going to be seeing in this Justice League movie, He said, "He's definitely different from previous incarnations. I feel like this is the natural progression from the end of Man of Steel into what he is now. This is a rebirth of the character. To coin the DC Comics franchise right now, it's a refresh. This movie highlights the qualities of Superman that exist in the comics. That's something I've always been very keen to highlight in the character. This rebirth provided the opportunity for me to play those characteristics." So mind you, this is him post reshoots, knowing what this Superman that we're all about to see in theaters is going to be. And he's all thumbs up. 2 thumbs gloriously held high. He also said, "I think there's an opportunity for these heroes to be represented in a way in which everyone can access. It should be funny. You should be able to take your kids to it. I've always enjoyed the traditional, very classic view on Superman in the comic books. I think there's an enormous complexity to that character. I know when I was working with Joss, he and I saw eye to eye on some of the aspects of Superman. That paragon of hope, that ideal, that wonderful feeling of, oh good, Superman's here. I have also developed a very personal and protective relationship over this character, and it was just lovely to have the opportunity to smile and feel good." Isn't that interesting? Like, I'm sorry to the Snyder fans of the world, to the people who see that and did not want to be reminded that Henry said that. But you have to understand that he knew what BVS did. He knew that this way that he had been represented so far was doing him no favors. And he was fully on board with basically moving on from Snyder's vision and completing the pivot that Joss Whedon's Justice League was trying to get us to, so that he could continue on as Superman in a more traditional, more classic vein. And yet, what happened? When November 17th, 2017 came around and Justice League was released, we learned exactly how much damage had been done by Batman vs. Superman. Because look, that movie, it bombed, okay? This was the first ever historic meeting of the Justice League on the big screen at a time when the Avengers had been running away to the bank for years now, at a time when the pump had been primed for superheroes and massive team-up adventures to be the biggest thing in the world. Justice League came out and didn't even hit 100 mil in its debut weekend. And the critical response was in the 40s. And despite all this insane work that had gone into the 11th hour overhaul of this movie, so few people turned up. And what you got to understand is that wasn't because of the reshoots. That wasn't because of Henry's face. Nobody knew about Henry's face yet. You know, only the hardcore geeks knew how much Justice League had been changed. To the rest of the world, they saw the trailers. And the trailers sold you a Zack Snyder DC superhero movie that is the direct continuation of Batman vs. Superman. So if you're someone who saw Batman vs. Superman in March of 2016 and you thought, ugh, the last thing you want to do now is go see Justice League, because you're thinking this is just more of that. It's not like the studio went out there and said, hey, everybody, get ready for a drastically different movie. We went and got the Avengers director to come in here and make it more something that you like. Like, they did all of this sneaky stuff behind the scenes that only certain reporters were willing to break silence and let you know what was coming, and you didn't believe those reporters. But most people didn't know. So when most people showed Justice League the cold shoulder, they did so because they didn't like the last movie, which in that particular line of stories wasn't Wonder Woman. It was Batman versus Superman. So when BVS came out and bombed, that essentially nuked Henry Cavill's Superman. That solo movie that had been in some stage of development since 2016 was now off the books, was now not a thing. And yet all his fans now had to cling to this idea of, well, he does have one movie left on his deal, and he really wants to make another Superman movie. You know, he was out there doing interviews, and Danny Garcia, his manager, was out there beating the drum of how we're going to see more Superman soon enough. And I was hearing all kinds of murmurs of meetings happening at Warner Brothers where Walter Hamada and the new people taking over for DC were making big top-level decisions about what happens next. And there was this brief window after Justice League where there was hope that we could get Superman flying again if we could just build on this new look at him that we got in Justice League and just continue on from there. We can, pull off this pivot. But Walter Hamada said no. Walter Hamada saw the writing on the wall, and he saw BVS bombing as the ultimate example of it is time to move on. So instead of getting a Man of Steel 2, or some kind of a Superman movie, instead, Henry's Superman went underground. After Justice League, he kind of went missing. And it wouldn't be until Shazam came out in spring of 2019 that we would almost get to see him again. Almost, I say, because, well, there had been a plan to actually include physically Henry Cavill's Superman in the movie. And even as far as back then, the hand of Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, was involved in this because he was involved loosely with that Shazam production. And there was hope that if we can get Henry into this and continue to establish him as Superman to the masses, then we can get to this Black Adam Superman confrontation that they wanted to make so badly, that The Rock's team was hoping to get to at some point. And I was actually the one who broke the exclusive story in January of 2019 that, yes, Henry Cavill's Superman is scheduled to have some sort of appearance in Shazam. And I was excited because I may not have been Superman on film at the time, but Superman's always just been my guy. It's always been my biggest hope was that Hollywood and Warner Brothers would get him right and we could finally have a new Superman movie in theaters every couple of years again. Because it's crazy. We'll get to that in a second. It's just crazy to think the juxtaposition of Christopher Reeve's run with Henry Cavill's run as Superman. And I was just trying, can we please just get into a rhythm here where he can do this? I've heard enough comments and interviews. I know the comic books he's inspired by. I know the filmmakers he wants to make movies with, like Christopher McQuarrie. Like, I believe in Henry's vision for Superman. So let's do this. So I remember being very excited and being very happy to share with the world on revengeofthefans.com that Henry will return for Shazam. And then unfortunately, I was made to be a liar. This is one of the reasons why I got out of the scooping stuff, because sometimes, you can be 100% spot on, and yet you can be made to be a liar retroactively. And David Sandberg would go on to reveal months later, that they did have a scene in the script for Henry Cavill's Superman, and that they were trying very hard to make that cameo happen. But ultimately, some red tape got in the way. Walter Hamada. Ultimately, some red tape got in the way, and instead of having Henry appear properly and have a real scene in the movie, they would just have a headless cameo where somebody wearing Henry's suit would show up as the final shot of the movie, and then we go to credits, and it's just a big ooh, Superman did come to, and it was just, ultimately, it became this cheap little headless cameo. And if you ask me, it's another slap in the face to Henry's Superman. You didn't let him get his sequel after Man of Steel. You put him in a movie where he's displayed miserably and then killed off. Then you put him in a movie that is half-baked like Justice League with bad effects where he looks like a joke. Where right out of the gate in the very first scene, his face looks mangled and he's a meme now. And then you have his Superman appear in Shazam without a head. Like, it's just, the amount of disrespect is staggering. All right. So Henry in Shazam, Headless Henry takes place. And after Headless Henry, we kind of go back into Superman being underground for a while. And from 2019 up until a very interesting announcement during the COVID pandemic, somewhere there in the middle of 2020, Superman was off the table again, and there was all this talk about how they were moving on, where Walter Hamada really didn't want Henry Cavill's Superman showing up anymore in anything, and that they were going to introduce a Supergirl in the Flash movie, and that Supergirl would be the new member of the Justice League who's Kryptonian, and we might introduce a brand new Superman down the line. So it didn't, Henry's Superman lied dormant until the Snyder Cut movement reached its zenith. Because remember, people finally, once they saw what happened to Justice League in November of 2017, people realized this was not Zack Snyder's movie. This was not the cut of the movie he was trying to put out there. So a campaign rapidly started getting into effect where people were saying, we want to see Snyder's cut. We want to see the version of the movie that Joss Whedon didn't touch. We want to see the cut of the movie where Superman's face is not blurry. We need a cut of the movie that's just what was the original vision. And after lots of ups and downs, it was during a Man of Steel fan viewing that Henry and Zack Snyder were both part of digitally, that they announced that the Snyder Cut was indeed happening, that we were going to get the release of the Snyder Cut over on HBO Max, and that finally the fans had won and it's going to happen. And what's funny is, for Zack Snyder's Justice League, Henry didn't have to shoot anything new. Henry basically, Zack was able to use all of the footage Henry had already shot back in the fall of 2016 and just rework some other Man of Steel footage. But Henry essentially didn't have to come back and don the suit again. And it's kind of funny to think, right? That means that, even though he was our active Superman, he had gone years without actually having to put on the suit and play him anywhere. And we saw him finally when Zack Snyder's Justice League came out in 2021. It was honestly rather glorious. There had been all this controversy about the black suit and why is he wearing the black suit for all of it? And he's only supposed to wear it for some of it. That's why he's regenerating his powers. But we want to see the classic red and blue by the end. There had been a little bit of controversy about his portrayal. But once that movie came out, I couldn't find anyone who thought that his Superman was poorly portrayed in that movie. Most people said they wished he had more screen time, which I'll even say that I wish he was in there more. But if you go and watch all 4 hours of Zack Snyder's Justice League, the character's treated with such reverence, with such love. And when Henry does finally get resurrected and we see him as Superman, he really does give off that real classic Superman energy. It really showed you he had it in him all along. He just needed that the right script or the right story or the right situation for us to really see him fly. So Zack Snyder's Justice League was this bittersweet thing for fans of his, because there he is in all his glory. And yet this isn't in a movie theater. This isn't the version of Justice League that the world was told to watch. This is just an alternate cut that only the hardcores are going to care about. And it's a performance that we're going to hold near and dear to our hearts forever. But to the masses, to the people who would determine whether or not Henry ever gets to be Superman again, the last thing they ever saw of him was his blurry face in a crappy, unwatched version of Justice League back in 2017. And that led us into the final two appearances of Henry Cavill as Superman. One was just a silhouette. Once again, Henry Cavill's Superman was brought in for some kind of effect, but not shown fully. So we had Headless Henry in Shazam, and then in Peacemaker, directed and written by James Gunn, there was an appearance by the Justice League in the season 1 finale. And in the Justice League, you could see the outlines, and it was the DCEU Snyderverse Justice League. You saw what looked like Ben Affleck's Batman. You saw what looked like Henry Cavill's Superman. And then you saw close-ups of Jason Momoa and Ezra Miller as Aquaman and the Flash. So once again, we wanted to evoke Henry's Superman, but not actually show him. It was once again just a stunt double in a suit disrespecting Henry's Superman again. And then the final disrespect came in the fall of 2022, when after years of rumors of the possibility of him showing up in a Black Adam movie, the rumors spiked up again in September, a month and a half before the release of the movie, that maybe an 11th hour deal had been struck. And now that Walter Hamada was basically out of power, and now that he was not the man in charge of DC, and now that the new owners, David Zaslav, were looking for a brand new person to run DC, Dwayne Johnson and his team saw an opportunity. There's a power vacuum. There's nobody really calling the shots yet. So let me go to the people who were temporarily in charge, which are Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdy at Warner Brothers Pictures, and let's push this idea of we want to get a Henry Cavill Superman cameo added to the end of Black Adam so that we could tease a confrontation between Black Adam and Superman, and B, start getting a Man of Steel 2 into development. And it worked for the first time in years, since there wasn't Walter Hamada there saying no, and there was this weird window of time where there was no one boss overseeing all of DC. Abdi and DeLuca said, sure, let's do it. Let's get Henry. And Henry was flown to Burbank, and he dyed his hair black, and he got the Man of Steel suit, and he shot a cameo for Black Adam, and he shot a cameo for the Flash, and I think he even shot another one. He got like $50,000 a pop for each one of these scenes that he shot in the suit that were going to be added into future DC movies. And when the movie came out, obviously the cat was out of the bag. You know, the Black Adam movie came out, and all of a sudden, the big thing everyone was talking about was not Black Adam. It was Superman. Henry Cavill's Superman showed up at the end, and that was the big headline. That was the big thing, and it kind of had to be. You know why? Because Black Adam was another failure. Black Adam was a box office bomb. Black Adam had a poor critical response. It was back to the doldrums of DCEU movies sucking again. All right. Say what you will about Walter Hamada's tenure as DC president, but the films were at least moderately well liked. They may not have had much box office success, but the people who saw Birds of Prey enjoyed Birds of Prey. Maybe not a lot of people saw Shazam, but the people who saw Shazam loved Shazam. And under Hamada's guidance, the DC movies had a certain level of goodness to them. And the Batman had come out earlier on in the year in 2022. So, you know, the bar had once again started getting rebuilt for DC on film. And yet, Black Adam was perceived to be a bad movie and wasn't seen by many people. And the big buzz wasn't on him, on Black Adam. It was on that little cameo, the 5 seconds that Henry Cavill got at the end of it. And once again, this meant that Henry's Superman was attached to a public failure. Henry Cavill's Superman had never been attached to something that everyone loved. Isn't that crazy? And it happened again. So Black Adam comes out. It's another negative story for DC, but Henry's face is linked to it. And they tried to use the goodwill of Henry's return to pivot the story. You know, right away, as soon as that weekend came and went with Black Adam, Henry was out there making announcements on Instagram. There were trade reports about meetings for Man of Steel 2 and different writers pitching things and Charles Roven speaking with directors. And all of a sudden, it's like we hit the ground running on this potential return of Man of Steel 2. And Henry Cavill in general, finally getting that second lease on life we've all been hoping for years. And what happened right after? Right after that announcement was made, it was also announced that DC had a new sheriff in town, and that James Gunn and Peter Safran were launching DC Studios, and they would be taking over the entire DC universe as we know it, and were likely to be rebooting and relaunching everything. So the very same week that fans were told Henry's coming back, and where Henry had apparently been given the thumbs up to let people know, I will be back, and he released beautiful imagery of himself as Superman like this, teasing that this is just the beginning of many things, that there's a lot more to come, and I can't wait to show you much more enormously joyful Superman stories. We're plunged into this limbo again of what's going to happen with Henry's Superman. There's a new boss in town, and if he's new, why exactly is he going to keep any of the old guys? You know, you don't hire a new boss because you're happy with what's going on and you want him to continue things. You hire a new boss because you're ready for something new, and you're ready for, it's time to break this open and start from scratch again. And unfortunately, it's true. The writing was on the wall. And the world began to wonder what is going to be the final decision here. And October came to a close, and we didn't know. And November came and went, and we didn't know. But then finally, on December 14th, 2022, Henry's tenure as Superman was officially terminated. On December 14th, 2022, James Gunn announced that he was writing and directing. Actually, at this time, I think it was just writing. He announced he was writing a reboot of Superman called Superman Legacy. It was going to center on a younger Superman, and it was not going to be bringing back Henry Cavill Superman, despite all the reports of a Man of Steel 2, despite the teases of a Black Adam versus Superman situation or some kind of Justice Society involvement, despite all the recent teases and interviews and imagery, James Gunn said, it's not going to be Henry. And Henry had to go out there, and just as quickly as he had announced his return, he had to announce his departure. He said, I have just had a meeting with James Gunn and Peter Safran, and it's sad news, everyone. I will, after all, not be returning as Superman. After being told by the studio to announce my return back in October, prior to their hire, this news isn't the easiest, but that's life. The changing of the guard is something that happens. I respect that. James and Peter have a universe to build. I wish them and all involved with the new universe the best of luck and the happiest of fortunes. For those who have been by my side through the years, we can mourn for a bit, but then we must remember, Superman is still around. Everything he stands for still exists, and the examples he sets for us are still there. My turn to wear the cape has passed, but what Superman stands for never will. It's been a fun ride with you all, onwards and upwards. And it really is a shame. And there's people to this day who have a hard time making heads or tails of James Gunn's decision. But here's where what I brought up earlier has to be factored in. We all saw different movies. And we can only go based on the movies that were released into theaters, the movies that were promoted as, this is the vision we want you to buy into. That's all we can go on. And when you go through Henry's run as Superman, it's not easy, it's not hard to understand why James Gunn felt the need to move on. You had Man of Steel, opened pretty strong and made pretty decent box office, but by all accounts, not the box office that Warner Brothers had hoped for. They wanted more. I'm not saying that they're right for that, but from their vantage point, they thought a Man of Steel reboot coming from the men who made you the Dark Knight trilogy and Zack Snyder. They thought, they expected more. The critics didn't love it, 50-something% on Rotten Tomatoes. Then we go to BVS theatrical cut, 26% on Rotten Tomatoes, and another film that just didn't live up to box office potential, and worse yet, became a meme for how sort of disliked many of its creative decisions were. Then the next time we saw him was in the theatrical cut of Justice League, where he looked silly and was given many kind of corny, crappy things to say and do. And then after that, we got a headless shot of him in Shazam. We got the one finally well-received part of his work, which was Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is his best reviewed work as Superman, and yet it was only ever seen by people on Max. And then we have that final little crumb at the end of Black Adam, a movie that bombed and wasn't well liked. So if you're James Gunn and you're looking at Henry Cavill's Superman, and you've just been given the responsibility of bringing Superman back up to proper heights again, you've got to realistically understand that this Superman never connected. This Superman never had that one big movie that made everyone fall in love with him. On the contrary, every movie he was a part of that made its way into theaters ended up being more notorious for its creative decisions than for how wonderful he was as Superman. And when you think of that, how could James Gunn have chosen him for this new movie? It would have poisoned this movie right out of the gate. It would have ruined the DC Universe's chances of ever succeeding, because it would have been built on a very, very negative, disliked foundation. And it's not Henry's fault that that's what he's associated with. It's not his fault that that's his legacy. And we know from previous quotes that he wanted Superman portrayed differently. He wanted stories that probably would have gone over much better with the masses. And he would have become this generation's Superman. Because to me, that's the thing that's just so kind of hard to believe. Because if you look at the actual years in which he was Superman based on screen appearances, Henry began in 2013 with Man of Steel, and he ended in 2022 with Black Adam. That's 9 years. Who else had 9 years? Christopher Reeve. His first Superman movie was 1978. His last Superman movie was 1987. And yet, in Christopher's 9 years, what did he get that Henry didn't? He got 4 movies. He got 4 solo adventures, 4 opportunities to fly into people's imaginations and establish himself as the Superman for a whole generation of fans. 4 opportunities to then also fly into your homes once those movies came to TV and to your local, Blockbuster Video. He had all these chances to win us over for years and years, showing him do quintessential Superman stuff. Showing, a classic Superman in a classic way, doing all the things that we know and love Superman to do. And that's why his 9 years are still what we talk about. Christopher Reeve, to many, is still the gold standard. And it's because he got 4 dedicated solo movies. And the funny thing is, most people don't even like the last 2. but they love Christopher. And since they got to see Christopher's Superman in all 4 of those movies, they loved his Superman. And if Henry had just been given a chance to have his Man of Steel 1, 2, 3, and 4, who knows where we'd be? He probably would have gotten a contract extension and we'd be building towards some Kingdom Come movie where he's older down the line at this point. But that was just never going to happen. It was never going to happen under the original creative hopes. Zack Snyder wasn't going to take him in that direction. Zack Snyder wanted to take him in a direction where after he's revived in Justice League, he gets taken over by Darkseid because Lois dies and he becomes evil Superman, and the Justice League has to fight evil Superman in a nightmare timeline in a post-apocalyptic future. So even in Zack Snyder's original version, Henry was not going to get that chance. His only opportunity would have been if the Joss Whedon Justice League had worked. If the Joss Whedon Justice League had worked, then, and people would have gone to see it, and it would have had great word of mouth, then from there, he would have had his Aquaman moment or his Wonder Woman moment where he made a movie post-Snyder where we finally got to see this character really shine in the way that we want them to. But he never got that opportunity. The studio lost all faith in him. And it's just crazy to think, too, because they probably lost faith in all of the Justice League after Justice League came out. Because when that movie bombs, that pretty much tells you that it's time to go back to the drawing board here. And yet they couldn't do that because they had already shot Aquaman. Like, Aquaman was already mostly in the can. And it's one of the interesting what ifs and interesting little points about Justice League, where if they were following a more traditional path, right? And Aquaman hadn't been filmed yet, and they were going to see how Justice League did before they proceeded with anything else, Aquaman would never have come out. Aquaman probably would have been canceled based on the performance of Justice League. And yet, the fact that it was already mostly shot is what saved it. And then that movie was the first DCEU movie and only DCEU movie to make $1 billion. So it's just it's such a perplexing thing, but it ultimately proved the point that Henry could have flown still. He could have had his own Aquaman. He just needed a solo movie that wasn't from Zack Snyder and that wasn't from David Goyer and Jonathan Nolan. He needed a fresh creative team to step in there and go, okay, he was brought back from the dead in Justice League, and now he's the more traditional Superman. So now what's the next story after Justice League? Let's go from there. Here we go. And it never happened. And it's not Henry's fault. And that's why when we look back on Henry Cavill's run as Superman, it's not hard to see that he was the most disrespected Man of Steel we got. The studio spit on his legacy every opportunity they could get. Everywhere that they could help him to flourish, they went in the wrong direction. And every opportunity they got to try to fix a mistake or make it right, they did it in the most harebrained way possible. And they ultimately killed what could have been this generation's Superman. And Henry instead is always going to be just another one of those what ifs, kind of like Brandon Routh was, where we got a taste under better creative. He could have been great, but alas, Christopher Reeve is still the mantle bearer for Superman. He has not been surpassed yet. And I hate to bring up comparisons, but, it's the way this works. Think about what Christian Bale was able to do with Batman. Up to that point, Michael Keaton had been the standard bearer. And when Christian Bale got that Dark Knight trilogy, he was able to own the part that, listen, people still love Michael Keaton's Batman, but there's also Christian Bale's Batman out there now. Nowadays, there really isn't that. There are the hardcore niche people who've seen the alternate cuts of the movies and also just happen to really take to that way of portraying him that love Henry Cavill's Superman. But by and large, to the masses, to the world, he never got that opportunity. And he was never really given a chance. So thank you, Henry, for the 9 years you gave us. I'm sorry that studio ineptitude and executive mismanagement and creative delusion poisoned your opportunity to be this generation's Superman. But thank you for all the time, all the passion, and all the energy you put into trying to play our boy the right way. And if you all want to see what I think of Henry's Superman, I actually did post a video tribute to him here on this channel. It's called Thank You, Henry. And I set it to what I consider the final theme for his Superman. Because the themes that we hear in Man of Steel, what are you going to do when you're not saving the world and all that stuff, they're much more contemplative and somber. And it's piano, and to me, those feel like the in training Superman theme. It's still him. It's the building blocks. It's his first day on the job. And it wasn't until Zack Snyder's Justice League, when he comes back in all his glory, that we hear the full triumphant version of those motifs, the full heroic anthem version of his theme. So I went and made this 2-minute tribute to Henry that you could find right here, because I think it captures his greatest moments as the character. And I hope you enjoy that. And I certainly, when it comes to Henry, my final takeaways are he could have been the guy. He could have been the guy, but he just never got the chance. And ultimately, his tenure was undone by people who had no idea what they were doing. And, the only silver lining I see in what happened with Henry is that was the final step in what needed to happen for the birth of DC Studios. Because James Gunn has spoken out against the way Henry was treated by the previous regime. James Gunn thinks that the way DC characters and properties have been handled for years over there is an outrage. And that's why he said, I'm only going to do this if I'm not Jeff Johns and John Berg, if I'm not Walter Hamada, if I'm not going to be an employee to Warner Brothers Pictures and have to make all these film executives happy with my movie so they can get their bonuses. No. I'm only taking over DC if I could launch my own totally separate studio called DC Studios, and I only have to answer to the money man at the top. And that's it. That's the only way I'm taking the job. And he got that. He got that autonomy. He's in control now. He could make sure that there is quality control. He could make sure that all the decisions regarding these characters and these actors and their trajectories, that all these decisions make sense and are going to lead to prosperous futures, not weird, dark, mysterious detours. So if there's one silver lining in what happened to Henry's Superman and to all of DC on film, it's that it brought us DC Studios at last. And hopefully now we're never going to have to deal with film executives rushing films into production with scripts that aren't ready and forcing movies to be released even when the test screenings are saying this movie is a disaster. We're in a new era now. And a major difference this time around, thanks to the lessons learned from Henry's run as Superman, is that DC Studios, right out of the gate, you can tell they're not trying to reinvent Superman. They're not approaching this next movie the way that Nolan was approaching Man of Steel, where they thought, okay, Superman can't work for the modern audience. We need to reinvent him and make him different so that modern audiences will appreciate him. We had to add all these other complex layers to him and yada, yada, yada. We got to liven him up and update him. This time, from everything that we've heard, James Gunn is more so trying to emphasize who Superman has always been. He's going with reverence to the source material and to the comics and trying to emphasize the classic Superman that we've always, most of us grew up knowing and loving and dreaming of hope, wishing they were real and wanting to meet them one day, For everyone That's what Superman has been. And he didn't need reinventing. You know, the way to approach his stories has always been to put our classic pure Superman into today's mucky world and see what that is like and see how he could influence that world and see how that world reacts to him. But you have to keep him pure. You don't change who he is, or you don't try to overthink the way he views his responsibility to Earth. Like, that's all just, it's a fine Elseworld tale. You know, if that whole Man of Steel through Darkseid and the anti-life equation and all that stuff Snyder wanted to do, if all of that stuff had been considered an Elseworld tale right out of the gate, like imagine it was happening now, right? Imagine under James Gunn's DC universe where he said that there can be that there is an Elseworld banner, right? And on the Elseworld banner, that's where the Batman movie takes place, and that's where, in theory, this the Black Superman movie that was being developed is going to take place at some point. So with that in mind, he could announce now, and we're going to tell an alien Superman first contact story that Zack Snyder is going to come in and tell, where you're going to see this alternate take that's very more real world and much more grown up. They're going to be, like R-rated, and it's going to be this unique Snyderian vision. I'm sure that story could have flourished if people went into Man of Steel expecting it to be that, while knowing that there is a classic, more understandable and known Superman thing that's also happening, like the one that he's making. Then I'm sure maybe that Snyder thing could have worked as its own very clear own offshoot off on one side that's not canon. It would be a unique thing, just like the in the books, because DC Comics, it was always been great with that, where there's the mainline continuity, but here's this Elseworld book from Frank Miller that isn't connected to anything and is just a warped look, a twisted perspective on what if this happened instead. You know, that sort of stuff is fascinating. And the Zack Snyder stuff could have been fascinating. I ended up loving Zack Snyder's Justice League. And I ended up seeing, like, you know what? He does get Superman. It took us a while to get there, but homie gets him after all. So, like, I would have loved to have seen. There's a part of me that, like, if there was a universe where they could continue, I would check that out. But unfortunately, we're just not there. It didn't happen. The box office numbers didn't support it. And now the best we could hope for is either maybe an animated version of it or a graphic novel version of it. I would take those. I'd be happy with that. I don't know about you guys, but I'd be very happy with that. But now, you know, since that's not the case, you know, since those films happened in a way where we were now being sold, well, this is Superman now. This is going to be what you have to accept. This is the mainline Superman. I think that's one of the other reasons people rejected. That people, you know, that there were people who clearly, they saw the theatrical cut of BVS and then just walked away. They didn't come back for more of that story. They came back for Wonder Woman because it looked and had nothing to do with that movie. It was set during World War I. It was very clear that that story has nothing to do with the whole Batman versus Superman deal. And she was actually one of the best parts of Batman versus Superman. So people gave Wonder Woman a chance. And they were rewarded for it. It was a beautiful movie that had its own third act tinkering that they were able to kind of pull off. But it was another one that had, you know, the studio's meddling to blame for some of its big glaring flaws. And the big running theme here is that studio meddling is gone now. It's gone now. And isn't that great? And isn't it great now to have a Superman movie that is on the way, that is not trying to reinvent him, that isn't self-conscious about Superman that actually put the red underwear back on. I mean, listen, I could have done without the red underwear. Listen, yeah, I know that's sacrilegious. And again, I'm not a traditionalist. I am, you know, I'm always open to new interpretations, and I'm kind of surprised that Gunn went with that. And there's still a part of me that thinks he might not have it by the end of the movie. Don't hate me, but I know somebody said if one in the comments, if he doesn't have the trunks by the end of the movie, I riot, and I like that, a riot of one. But yes, aside from it's very clear that Gunn is going to say no. This is Superman, and let's be proud of who and what Superman is and always has been. And I know some people are annoyed this week at a comment from Mark Waid about, how reverential James Gunn is, because then he ended up throwing a needless dig at Zack Snyder. And I have to admit, like, the Zack Snyder dig didn't have to happen. You know what I mean? He in the quote, he says essentially that, he's excited for the next movie. And this is coming from Mark, who really wasn't a big fan of Man of Steel. And I've interviewed Mark Waid. You could find that interview here on the Superman on Film YouTube channel. But, he's made it it's been no secret what he thought of Man of Steel. And he found a way to bring it all back to that. Because in the quote, he's like, I'm very excited for James Gunn's movie. I love the way he handles things. He's very reverential to the comics, but he doesn't take it too seriously. And look, we're going to have a super-powered dog. We're going to have Crypto, a dog with heat vision. This is totally not a Zack Snyder thing. And it's like, oh, did you have to throw in the thing about Snyder, But the heart of what he's saying was, what Zack is trying to do is take what's worked and lean into all of what Superman is, including some of the ridiculous, and it being okay. As opposed to, oh, we're nervous about Superman. Let's hide the underwear. Let's scrub these other goofier parts of his universe and let's simplify him down. And that's why Hollywood's just been insistent on giving us over and over again Superman versus Zod and Zod hating Jor-El and that whole foundation, like as if that's the only way to present Superman on the big screen. But yes, so there were lessons learned. And this movie is not going to have any of that. And it's unfortunate that Henry couldn't be a part of this moment when lessons were finally learned. But unfortunately, it is what it is. We can't do anything about that now. But thank you, Henry, for your time. And thank you, viewers and listeners, for your time. If you like the show, please mash that subscribe button. And don't forget to like, rate, and review the Superman On Film podcast. And until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up, and away.